On the 6th of February, 1952, a valet walked into a bedroom at Sandringham House and found the king dead. George VI was 56. A blood clot had reached his heart sometime during the night, and just like that, the reign was over. His daughter was 4,000 miles away, perched in a treehouse in Kenya. Not a metaphorical treehouse, an actual wooden observation lodge called Treetops, built into the canopy of a fig tree above a watering hole in the Aberdare Forest. Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip were on the first leg of a Commonwealth tour, one they were doing because the king was too sick to travel himself. She'd said goodbye to her father at London Airport on the 31st of January, and witnesses on the tarmac that day noticed how gaunt he looked, standing hatless in the wind, waving at the plane as it climbed. 6 days later, he was gone. Philip's private secretary, Mike Parker, caught the Reuters wire first, confirmed it by telephone with Buckingham Palace, Parker told Philip. Philip took his wife for a walk along a riverbank near Sagana Lodge, and in the space of a single sentence, Elizabeth became queen. She was 25. She flew home immediately, arriving at Heathrow on the 7th of February in the black mourning clothes that had been packed in her luggage as a precaution, because everyone close to the king had known this trip might end early. Churchill was waiting on the tarmac. So was Clement Attlee, leader of the opposition, and her uncle, the Duke of Gloucester. The formal proclamation of accession happened the next day, the 8th of February, at St. James's Palace, read aloud by the Garter King of Arms. She was queen. The constitutional machinery ground into motion, and then it hit a wall. Or, more precisely, it hit a woman sitting in the private apartments of Buckingham Palace, who showed no particular inclination to move. Here's what should have happened. The tradition is clear and stretches back to 1837, when Queen Victoria made Buckingham Palace the sovereign's official London residence. When the monarch dies, the new monarch moves in. The widowed queen consort moves out. This isn't a family discussion. It isn't negotiable. The palace is not a home. It's an office. And the job had changed hands. There was precedent for doing this gracefully. When George V died in 1936, Queen Mary relocated from Buckingham Palace to Marlborough House with the kind of crisp efficiency that characterized everything she did. She understood, implicitly, that the palace belonged to the crown, not the consort. Even the notoriously difficult Queen Alexandra, widow of Edward VII, had eventually vacated after her husband's death in 1910, though she'd made George V and Queen Mary wait with visible impatience before she did. The precedent of Queen Alexandra was not a flattering one to echo. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon echoed it anyway, and then exceeded it. The new queen didn't move into Buckingham Palace in February 1952. She didn't move in during the spring. Didn't move in during the summer. Not the autumn, not the winter. For roughly 15 months, from February 1952 until May 1953, just weeks before her coronation on the 2nd of June, the Queen of the United Kingdom conducted the business of the crown from Clarence House, the comparatively modest residence on the Mall, where she and Philip had been living since shortly after their 1947 wedding. 15 months. The sovereign of the United Kingdom, running an empire from her old flat. The reason was simple, even if nobody at court would have been vulgar enough to say it out loud. Her mother was still in Buckingham Palace and wouldn't leave. Now, of course, she was grieving. Nobody disputes that. George VI and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had been married for 29 years, and by every account it was a genuine love match. But grief doesn't explain 15 months. Grief doesn't explain what happened next, or what happened after that, or what kept happening for the next 5 decades. Grief is a season. What the Queen Mother built was an institution. But before we get there, consider the trap Elizabeth II was caught in, because it was almost perfectly engineered to prevent her from acting. She was 25, with zero experience of governance beyond a brief wartime stint in the Auxiliary Territorial Service. Sitting across from her was a woman who'd been Queen Consort for 16 years, who'd shared the Blitz with Londoners, who was adored by Churchill, who was the dominant social force in the British aristocracy, and who was, this is the part that made it impossible, her mum. The entire nation was draped in mourning for George VI. Public sympathy flowed entirely toward the widow. For Elizabeth to have demanded her mother vacate the premises would have looked, to the country, like a daughter throwing a grieving woman into the street before the king was cold in his grave. Which was, of course, the point. Sir Alan Lascelles, Tommy Lascelles, was the private secretary to the crown at the time, a formidable old-school courtier who'd served the monarchy since the 1920s. He was the man tasked with making the transition work, and he was watching it not work. Biographers including Ben Pimlott and Robert Lacey have documented his agonizing position in those first months, caught between a young sovereign who needed her official residence and a dowager queen who found it perpetually inconvenient to discuss logistics. Lascelles was not a man who tolerated inefficiency. He'd survived working for Edward VIII, a king he privately despised, and had helped manage the abdication crisis with surgical coldness. He understood the machinery of monarchy better than almost anyone alive. And here he was, unable to get a widow to pack her bags. His private writings suggest real frustration, the kind that curdles into something harder when you can't express it publicly. The problem wasn't that anyone had said no. That would have been manageable. Open defiance can be met with open pressure. The Queen Mother hadn't refused to leave. She hadn't said no. She'd done something far more effective. She'd said nothing at all. Too grief-stricken to discuss it. Too fragile to be pressed. Always next month. Always soon. Time itself became her argument, and Lascelles, for all his formidable reputation, couldn't fight time. Think about what this meant in practical terms. Day after day, the business of the crown operated from the wrong address. State papers arrived at Clarence House. Foreign dignitaries were received there. The red boxes, those daily dispatch cases containing government documents requiring the monarch's attention, went to the Mall, not to the palace. The ambassadors knew. The government knew. The entire Whitehall apparatus knew that the Queen of the United Kingdom couldn't fully inhabit her role because she couldn't fully inhabit her residence. The symbolism quietly rotted. Every week the situation continued. The new queen looked a little less like a sovereign and a little more like a daughter who couldn't manage her own mother. Nobody could bring themselves to say the obvious thing. Certainly not Elizabeth herself. Certainly not while the nation still had black crepe in the windows. Philip saw it, though. He always saw it. Prince Philip had never enjoyed what you'd call a warm relationship with his mother-in-law, and the palace standoff took every existing friction and ground it into something sharp. He and Elizabeth had made Clarence House their home. They'd overseen its renovation in 1949, turning a neglected royal residence into something genuinely personal, one of the few spaces where Philip had felt he had any domestic authority. Now his mother-in-law wasn't just refusing to leave the palace that protocol demanded she vacate. When she finally did move, she moved into his former home. Savor that for a moment. The Queen Mother would spend the next 49 years living in the house her daughter and son-in-law had renovated, decorated, and been forced to surrender. The woman who claimed to want nothing took her daughter's home as a consolation prize. But even before the move happened, slowly, reluctantly, with the manner of someone bestowing a favor rather than fulfilling an obligation, there was the question of what to call her. This sounds trivial. It isn't. The traditional title for a widowed queen consort is Queen Dowager. Correct, historical, and blunt, it carries a clear implication. Your time is over. The prefix dowager performs the same function in royal language that retired does in corporate language. It acknowledges what you were while making unmistakably clear that you no longer are. Elizabeth Bowes Lyon found this intolerable. The title Queen Dowager was, in her view, diminishing, aging, suggestive of irrelevance. So an alternative was constructed, one that had been used informally before, but never adopted as an official style. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Look at that construction carefully. Queen appears twice. Dowager doesn't appear at all. The title doesn't say former. It doesn't say retired. It says Queen, and then says it again, with mother appended not as a limitation, but as an amplification, as though motherhood of the sovereign were a promotion rather than a circumstance. This wasn't a title bestowed by Parliament or demanded by precedent. It was, in practical terms, a title she claimed for herself. And the institution, as it would do again and again for 50 years, said yes. A woman who genuinely wanted to step back wouldn't have fought over nomenclature. She'd have accepted Queen Dowager with the good grace of someone who understood the role had passed. Instead, the Queen Mother, and we should note that this name, now so familiar it sounds inevitable, was essentially her own invention, insisted on a title that kept her as close to the throne as language would allow, without actually sitting on it. She never wanted to be queen. She just didn't want anyone to forget she had been. So, the gilded consolation. When the Queen Mother finally vacated Buckingham Palace in 1953 and settled into Clarence House, the public narrative was one of dignified sacrifice, a widow retreating to a quieter life. The reality of what quieter meant deserves scrutiny, because it was quieter only in the way a 5-star hotel is quieter than a 6-star one. Clarence House isn't a cottage. It's a substantial 4-story residence on the Mall, originally built between 1825 and 1827 for the Duke of Clarence, the future William IV. Under the Queen Mother's occupation, which began in 1953 and didn't end until her death in 2002, it became something extraordinary. A parallel court, staffed and maintained on a scale that rivaled the working palace she'd supposedly left behind. Staff numbers varied by account, but biographers consistently placed the Queen Mother's household at Clarence House at roughly 50 people. A private secretary, equerries, ladies-in-waiting, a page of the backstairs, butler, footman, housemaids, cooks, chauffeurs, a dresser. For a woman with no constitutional function, no state duties, no official role in governance whatsoever, 50 people, no job. She entertained constantly. Lunches and dinners at Clarence House became legendary in London society. Generous, lavish, and conducted with complete disregard for anything resembling a budget. Guests recalled evenings that began with gin and Dubonnet, her signature drink, which the press treated as an endearing quirk rather than a line item, moved through courses of salmon and game, and were accompanied by champagne. Veuve Clicquot was the house staple, with cases of Krug for variety. The wines were excellent. The conversation was better. The bills were someone else's problem. She was, by all accounts, a magnificent hostess, the kind who makes you forget that the candles, the silver, the staff pouring your glass, all of it is being charged to the public ledger. And Clarence House wasn't her only address. Within months of the king's death, 1952, barely into her supposed retreat from public life, the Queen Mother purchased the Castle of May on the remote north coast of Caithness, the most northerly castle on the British mainland, looking out across the Pentland Firth toward Orkney. Its acquisition was framed as a romantic gesture of grief. She'd seen the ruin while visiting friends, fallen in love, decided to restore it. The restoration was extensive. The annual visits were regular. The cost was never publicly discussed, which in royal accounting usually means it was considerable. That's 2 residences. There was a third. Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, a substantial country house that had been the family's weekend retreat since the 1930s, remained in her possession, with its own staff, its own household, its own running costs. 3 homes, 50-odd staff at the main one alone, almost 5 decades of occupation, all maintained by a woman whose public persona was that of a modestly living grandmother who'd never sought the trappings of royalty. Which brings us to Philip, because if the palace standoff established the pattern and Clarence House demonstrated its scale, the Queen Mother's treatment of Prince Philip reveals the sharpness underneath, the moments where the charming dowager's mask didn't just slip, it fell off. The hostility was partly social, partly personal, and entirely strategic. Philip was born Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, but those titles disguised a childhood of upheaval and near poverty. His family had been exiled from Greece when he was an infant. He'd been educated at Gordonston, Kurt Hahn's deliberately austere school in the Scottish Highlands, as far from Eton as you could get while staying on the same island. His mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg, had spent years in a sanatorium. His sisters had married German aristocrats, some with uncomfortable Nazi-adjacent connections. Philip himself had served with genuine distinction in the Royal Navy during the war, the Mediterranean, the Pacific. But none of it erased what the Queen Mother and her circle saw as his fundamental problem. Biographers have recorded that they privately called him the Hun. One word. That's all it took to reduce a decorated war veteran to his bloodline. Not Philip, not the Duke. The Hun. And this wasn't some slip. It was a label, used casually, almost affectionately, in the way that aristocratic cruelty is always most devastating when it sounds like a joke. But the snobbery was just the surface. Underneath was a power struggle that shaped the first decade of the new reign. Before Elizabeth's accession, Philip had been master of his own household at Clarence House. Small domain, but his. He made decisions, managed staff, set the tone. He'd been a naval officer, a commander with a career trajectory that he'd surrendered for the crown. That sacrifice was supposed to be exchanged for something. Authority within his own family, his own home, some sphere where he mattered. When the family finally moved to Buckingham Palace, Philip walked into an institution run by courtiers who'd served Elizabeth's father, who answered to tradition rather than to him, and who regarded the new consort as a temporary inconvenience the monarchy would outlast. The Queen Mother was, by temperament and by network, allied with this old guard. She and Lascelles and the palace establishment formed an informal coalition whose shared assumption was simple. The monarchy's traditions mattered more than the new queen's husband's feelings. These were men and women who'd built their careers around George VI's court, who saw continuity as a sacred obligation, and who had a dowager queen whispering, always gently, always charmingly, always with plausible deniability, that perhaps Philip wasn't quite ready for this much responsibility. Philip was systematically marginalized, excluded from decisions, denied access to state papers, prevented from modernizing the palace household in ways he thought necessary. He'd wanted to streamline operations, cut redundancies, bring the institution into the 20th century. The old guard didn't want the 20th century. They wanted 1936 with better plumbing. How much of this was the Queen Mother's direct orchestration versus the culture she'd spent 16 years as consort embedding into the institution? The honest answer is impossible to fully separate. She didn't need to issue orders. She'd built the system. The system did the work. But the most consequential fight, the one that left a scar Philip carried for decades, was about a name. When Elizabeth became queen, Lord Mountbatten, Philip's uncle, reportedly boasted that the House of Mountbatten now reigned. This was exactly the kind of statement calculated to horrify the Queen Mother and the old court. She lobbied hard, alongside Churchill and Lascelles, to ensure the royal house remained the House of Windsor. The name George V had adopted in 1917 to shed the family's German associations. The irony of using anti-German sentiment against Philip, a man they also called the Hun, apparently escaped no one and bothered no one. She won. On the 9th of April 1952, barely 2 months after the accession, Elizabeth II declared the royal house would continue as the House of Windsor. Philip's response became one of the most quoted lines in 20th century royal history. "I am the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children." The Queen Mother had erased him from the dynasty's letterhead, and she'd done it while living in his old house. Now, the money. Because every prosecution needs a financial trail, and the Queen Mother's is spectacular. She received substantial annual payments from the civil list, the public funding mechanism for the royal family, to support her official activities. What constituted official activities for a woman with no constitutional function was generously defined. She also raced horses. Not a horse, horses. Over the decades, she owned or part-owned dozens of them, campaigning actively over national hunt fences. That's steeplechasing, not flat racing, which tells you something about her personality. She liked watching things hurdle obstacles at speed, preferably while she held a drink. The training fees, the jockeys, the transport, the upkeep. National hunt racing isn't cheap, even for people who aren't maintaining 3 residences and 50 staff. She drank well, dressed immaculately, traveled extensively, hosted relentlessly. And every year, the gap between what came in and what went out grew a little wider. Not because she didn't know, because she didn't care, or rather, and this is the crucial distinction, because she knew she'd never have to. By the time of her death on 30 March 2002, at the age of 101, the Queen Mother had reportedly accumulated an overdraft at Coutts Bank, the royal family's bank of choice, estimated at somewhere between £4 and £7 million. Not a bad investment, not a market downturn. An overdraft. A permanent running tab that she'd maintained for years, possibly decades, with the serene confidence of someone who knew the institution would never let the check bounce. Think about what an overdraft of that size means. It means she spent more than she was given, every year, for years on end. It means Coutts extended her credit not because she was good for it, but because of who she was, or rather, who would be embarrassed if she wasn't. It means she treated the public purse the way she treated Buckingham Palace, as something that existed for her use, to be vacated on her schedule, if ever. She was right not to worry. Elizabeth II reportedly settled her mother's debts after her death. The daughter paid the mother's bills. Again. And here's the thing that ties it all together. The detail that makes the palace standoff not just an opening anecdote, but a skeleton key to the whole story. The Queen Mother lived from 1900 to 2002. 101 years. She spent nearly 50 of those years at Clarence House, accumulating staff and debts and myth in roughly equal measure. Her longevity wasn't just a biological fact, it was a strategic advantage. She outlived Tommy Lascelles. She outlived Churchill. She outlived nearly every courtier and contemporary who'd witnessed the palace standoff, the title fight, the marginalization of Philip, the early power plays. By the time biographers like Hugo Vickers, William Shawcross, and Sarah Bradford began piecing together the private reality behind the public image, the Queen Mother had had decades to cement the alternative version. The gin and Dubonnet granny. The twinkling eyes. The wave. The public loved her because the public saw what she wanted them to see. And she'd been performing it for so long that the performance had become indistinguishable from the person, at least to anyone who wasn't family. Step back for a moment. A woman who publicly claimed she never wanted to be queen, who performed reluctance like a virtuoso, who, when the role ended, refused to leave the palace for 15 months, invented a title to avoid the word dowager, moved into her daughter's renovated home, maintained a 50-person household across 3 residences, marginalized her son-in-law, erased his name from the dynasty, entertained London society on a permanent overdraft, raced horses she couldn't afford, and left her daughter to clean up the financial wreckage, all while the nation called her its grandmother. The Buckingham Palace standoff of 1952 wasn't an anomaly, wasn't a grief response. It was a thesis statement. Everything that followed, the title, the spending, the parallel court, the power plays, the debts, was just footnotes to that first refusal. She'd learned, in those 15 months, that if you perform sadness with enough conviction, nobody will call it what it actually is. Entitlement. Elizabeth II spent 50 years navigating the gap between her mother's public image and her mother's private demands. The sweet grandmother of the nation. The woman who clung to every privilege of the crown while insisting she'd never wanted any of them. She outlived nearly everyone who could have told a different story. 101 years on this earth, 5 decades at Clarence House, long enough to become the myth she'd constructed. And when she died, her daughter paid her debts. Quietly, without complaint. The way she'd been paying them, one way or another, since that February morning in 1952, when a 25-year-old queen came home from Kenya and found her mother sitting in her chair. She never wanted to be queen. She just wanted everything that came with it. If this changed the way you see the royals, subscribe for more stories like this one.